Hello YouTube. In this short video series, we're going to go over we're going to start off with some high poly design concepts, some things you should be aware of when you're doing a high poly model. What you're looking at, this is a shotgun that I recently did for a client, and they were cool enough to let me use it for making videos. So that was very cool of them. There's some, so we're talking about some high poly principles here. Then we're going to low poly the model, and we're gonna, UV bake it and give it a basic texture. And we'll talk about each stage along the way. But first up, let's talk about the high poly. So the first thing that I like to stress to people when they ask me for advice on high poly models is I'm a big believer, and this got drilled into me early in my career, to make things look like they were constructed. Like, you've all seen those models where somebody will give you something and it looks like the whole model was carved out of a single piece of metal or something. And I really like to see, when I'm reviewing a mesh, I like to see just stuff like this, like these little bolts, these panel lines cut into it, just stuff that implies how the mesh was constructed, how it's held together. And even, beyond screw heads and panel lines, you have stuff like layering, right? You got this piece, that kind of tucks inside of this piece, which tucks inside of this piece, and then it has this layered piece on top with a flared bit up here for whatever this laser sight thing is. Just stuff that implies how the mesh was put together. There's a better shot down here of that plating sort of thing, like here, 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 here. That layering, to me, is a good indicator of how something was constructed. Now I know what you're thinking, because I'm thinking it while I'm recording it. Aren't most of these details added in Substance Painter or Quixel these days? And the answer is, it depends. It depends on how your art director wants to work, and it depends how you work. But generally, yeah, I would probably add most of these bolts in Substance Painter, and even some of the panel lines I would too. But there's a trade-off, because when you put them in the high poly like this, you get a much nicer render, which can help get things approved faster than saying, well, just trust me, there'll be little bolts and things, and this will look cool, believe me. Or you can go ahead and just stick them on there using the mesh paint tool or whatever. Even if it's only temporary, that might be a way to look at it too. This is just some temporary voltage to get the idea across. But anyway, that's getting a little away from the point. The point is, anything that implies how a high poly model was constructed is going to help to sell it visually to whoever has to review it. Now, the second point that I'll make is, when building a high poly mesh like this, you're probably better off following the general rule, and I've talked about this before, of if something is a separate piece on the mesh, then it should probably be a separate piece on your model. It just makes it easier to put it together. If you think about it like a physical object, in this case, this overlay is a separate piece, this is a separate piece. You can probably hear my dog snoring in the background. Sorry about that. This is a separate chunk, that's a separate chunk. This adjustment wheel sits inside of this housing, which are separate pieces. And once you accept that reality, like when I started modeling, I had this weird preoccupation with making everything from a watertight mesh. And I don't know why I started that way, but it sort of felt right. But now with the rounded edge shader, and all the tools we have available to us today, there's no reason not to build something from separate pieces and just stick it together. So if you're not already doing that, I would give it a shot on your next mesh, because you really can save yourself a lot of time. And the final principle that I'll talk about before we can move on to the low poly work is contrast of detail, I guess, is what I would call it. It probably has a proper name, but the general idea is you'll have areas of high density detail and areas of low density detail. And unless the art direction for your project specifically calls for like hyper detail everywhere, you should probably leave some areas that are relatively clean. You can see I've got this, we can call this high frequency through here, through this part here, these teeth that are sitting down here, this bit, this wheel. Those are what I would call relatively high areas of detail contrast, because your eye is drawn to those. You're like, oh, what's the curly thing? What's that thing over there? But the model also offers lots of areas where you can rest your eyes, where it's just the flow of the metal is carrying the visual language. So these plates on top, the top of the gun is relatively smooth, except for there's some contrast here and some contrast here, but generally the top of the gun is pretty clean in terms of detail. And I think that from a design standpoint really helps. That helps to sell the model as well, because typically people won't put detail like on every single square inch of something. So that gives you some different things to focus on when you're looking at the mesh. And the best example that I can give of this is if you look at cars. So if you look at a Ferrari, for example, this has the exact same sort of principles going on. You've got these large flat, well not flat, but these large areas that don't have a ton of detail on them, but they do have smoothing brakes, and they have cut-ins and edges and stuff just to carry the light and break up the light. But the surface itself is relatively free of detail. And looking here, you have the high frequency detail on the wheels, the headlights, the front grille. Those are where the detail collects. And the body is where the detail retreats and lets your eyes rest and enjoy the shape and lines of the car. So anyway, having talked your ear off about high poly modeling, we're going to move into the low poly phase in the next video. See you then.